Well, all right. I will start by announcing the sponsors for today's event. So today's event is sponsored by Ellen Hertzmark, and it's also sponsored by, and I quote, Rabbi Finkelman's former neighbors and parking space renters, Dvora and Jerry Baranovsky. Rabbi Dr. Finkelman is a longtime educator, pulpit rabbi, writer. He asked me to keep this brief, so I will do that. And he is currently at Congregation Or Chadash in Oak Park, Michigan. And with that, I'll let Dr. Finkelman introduce his topic of Ein Shliach לדבר עבירה, or there's no agency for improper behavior.
Thank you for that introduction, Michael. I appreciate it. I also appreciate, and I want to say so publicly, Rabbi Hellman for giving me permission to speak on his turf, and for Ellen Hertzmark for having arranged this, and of course to the sponsors, my erstwhile neighbors. So I anticipate that this will begin slowly and get more and more heated as I go along. The topic I chose because in 1971, which is coming on 50 years ago, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein of blessed memory gave a class to his Talmud students on Ein Shaliach Lidvar Avera that I found electrifying. And I always look forward to occasions to revisit that class. And I hope I do not disappoint his memory too much by what happens in this class. If I decided I wanted to invest in high quality art, I wanted to buy an old master, I would not go down to Sotheby's myself and bid in an auction. I would hire a professional agent to make the bid on the artwork. And of course, if I won the bid, I would have to pay for it. I don't know how to do that, but I would have to pay for it. And the art would belong to me. The professional agent who made the deal would disappear as soon from the contract. When the professional agent said that the contract was valid, agreed to it, made the winning bid, I would become the owner of the art. That's how agency works in general. And we have the same principle in Jewish law. It's called shlichut. The modern Hebrew word for an agent is a sochen, but in Talmudic Hebrew, those of us who study Talmud have met this word. The word is a shaliach, someone who is sent. And the person who sends the shaliach is in English called the principal, even if he or she is not a headmaster of a school. And the principal in Talmudic Hebrew is called the mishaleach, the person who sends. The key discussion in the Talmud occurs in Kedushin, in Masechet Kedushin, where the Talmud avers shlichut works. And in Kedushin, it's talking about shlichut, agency for effecting a marriage. Normally, there's that beautiful young woman in the white dress and the handsome young man in the tuxedo or kittel or whatever the chatan wears. But in fact, they don't have to be there. If they don't want to be there, they could send agents instead. And the marriage would be just as valid, although perhaps not as emotionally exciting. Shlichut minalan, the Gemara asks, how do we know that shlichut even works? that you can have such a thing as agency. Tanya vishalach, melamed shehu ose shaliach. And this is a drawn from reading, it's Midrash Halacha, it's drawn from reading a biblical text, the biblical text in Devarim that talks about marriage and divorce, and has a light word, has a repeated word of vishilcha, the shoresh, the root, shalach, to send, occurs again and again and again in this section. And the Talmud derives from this word, rather than the word for divorce, legaresh, that it could be done by an agent. Actually, v'shilcha melamed shehi osa shaliach, v'shaliach, v'shalach, v'shalcha. This repeated word teaches us also that the bride, the potential bride, can make an agent to affect the wedding and can make an agent to affect the divorce as well. Controversy about how that works. Interesting question, can a man appoint a woman to represent him at a wedding? Can a woman appoint a man? That's not the only limud. The same Talmudic passage has a different one. The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha minayan sheshalucho shel adam kimoto shenemar v'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael ben ha'arbaim. Not talking about weddings at all, but talking about the paschal lamb or kid. The Torah says the entire congregation of Israel slaughters the lamb. And if you think about it, the entire congregation can't slaughter one lamb. For that matter, if it's a mitzvah on each and every one of us, there's no way we can do that, because the lamb or kid is eaten by a team of people who have to be assigned in advance. And really only one person is going to slaughter it. All the other members are vicariously going to benefit from having it slaughtered. So that might be proof that there is such a thing as agency. I forgot to share the screen. Excuse me. I've been talking as if you could see the screen that I'm looking at. Share screen. And there it is, I think. Did that work? Can you see it? Did that work?
Now I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, good. So there's a different source. The Mechilta actually has other sources for the effectiveness of agency. The Mechilta learns it from everybody has to draw a lamb or a kid to be the Korban Pesach. And obviously, the poor lamb or kid doesn't get drawn by every single member of the team. As other limudim too. This is an example. There are many other examples of it, but this is an example of the phenomenon that the Midrash Halacha sometimes knows where it's going and derives the halacha from different sources, converging on the same source. It's kind of convergent evolution in the Midrash Halacha. But agency does not work to do evil. Why not? Because the agent has independent responsibility. And the Sifra derives it from a verse, Dam yechashev la'ish hahu. The person who slaughters a sacrifice outside of the courtyard of the tabernacle bears the blood guilt. That person, la'ish hahu, gets a lot of emphasis. That's the person. If somebody else advised him and said, it's a good idea to sacrifice someplace else, the person who gave the bad advice is not chayav. The person who actually did the slaughtering is chayav, even though agency, if I asked you to do something and you did it on my behalf, usually the agent evaporates and the deed gets credited to the principal, to the mishaleach, but not in this case. And the Talmud Yerushalmi derives not in any other case where it involves doing something evil or prohibited. There's another way to learn it. We learn it from a Mishnah. It's quoted in the same text in Kiddushin, but it's a Mishnah in Bava Kama. V'haditnan hasholeach et habira biyad cheres shota v'katan patur midinei adam v'chayav midinei shamayim. If you send a minor or a deaf mute or a person who's psychotic to deliver a fire, you who have handed this fire over to an irresponsible person cannot be held responsible in Jewish law, although b'dinei shamayim, you're really guilty by the laws of heaven, but a human court can't punish you. Biyad pikeach, what if I gave the fire to a responsible adult and he went and set fire to somebody's house or somebody's haystack? Pikeach chayav. The person I gave the fire to is liable. The halachically competent person is liable. That's another case of ein shaliach lidvar avera. The person who actually set the fire is liable. The miscreant, the evil person who gave him the fire and asked him to burn down somebody else's house, if this were agency, he should be responsible, but apparently he's not. And the Talmud asks, why is he not? Why is the person, the shaliach, the agent, responsible? Va'amai, nema shlucha shel adam kimoto. Let's say that he's an agent working for the principal, and therefore the principal should be responsible. The Talmud answers, shani hatam de'ein shaliach b'dvar avera. This is different because there's no agency to do evil. And now we get a different explanation, not derived from a verse, but derived from pure logic. Svara. Divrei harav v'divrei hatalmid, divrei mi shom'im. The agent had the opportunity to listen to me because I said burn down my neighbor's house. And he had the opportunity to listen to God, who says, don't burn down my neighbor's house. And of course, the agent should have listened to God and not listened to a human being. And if he did the terrible thing of burning down someone's house, then he, the agent, is responsible. That argument from svara, from logic, as opposed to deriving it from some biblical verse, that argument from logic suggests that we could examine each case and figure out logically, does it really work out that the agent should be guilty and the principal should not be? And we'll discover that the Talmud considers some cases just by looking at logic to say otherwise. For instance, the case in Bava Kama, where Haresha Ganav Tlemen Ha'eder V'Amar LeKohen told Tlezeh Shehu Shali. Somebody stole a lamb from the flock of somebody else, and he said to a Kohen, O Netano LeKohen Livchorot B'no. He owed the Kohen for Pidyon Haben, And he said, would you take this nice lamb? And the Kohen takes the lamb. Well, the Kohen is walking off with the lamb, and we want to make the Kohen guilty and the thief not guilty. No, you can't do that, because the Kohen didn't realize he was stealing. The Kohen thought he was taking the lamb that he was entitled to. It was given to him by somebody. That's an exception to Ein Shaliach Lidvar Avera, and many rabbinic commentators understand that to mean if the shaliach, if the person who actually does the evil deed has no way of knowing that it's an evil deed, and the mishaleach, the principal, knows that it's an evil deed, of course the principal is guilty and the agent is not. Another exception, and this one seems extravagantly artificial, when dealing with an inanimate object. There's in halacha, my fenced-in yard acquires objects from me. Throw something into my yard, and I can claim it as mine. There's a dispute in the Talmud about whether I can declare it as mine because it's like my hand, or I can declare it as mine because it's like my shaliach, like my agent, my metaphoric agent. When the stolen object is found in the thief's possession, he pays an additional fine. His courtyard counts as in his possession. But if you examine the courtyard or conceptualize the courtyard as a kind of agency, then if my neighbor's animal wanders into my yard and I, the landlord, close the gate, I've stolen the animal, but I say, no, I didn't really steal the animal. My yard stole the animal. So, Ein Shliach Lidvar Avera, my yard's at fault. I'm not. No, that doesn't work. Obviously, that can't work. Ravina says it doesn't work because the inanimate object is not subject to commandments. Rav Sama says because the inanimate object has no choice. Two different arguments for why the inanimate object can't be guilty of a crime. Hecha da'amrinan de'ein shliach l'dvar avera, hecha de'shaliach. Oh, my typing got bad. Bar chiyuvahu, aval b'chatzer, delav bar chiyuvahu, michayev sholcho. Simple enough, that's Ravina's position. Rav Sama says, Hecha de amrina and ein shaliach lidvar avera, Hecha de iboy avid, iboy lo avid. Aval chatzer, de bal korchei, motiv ba, mechayev sholcho. The courtyard does not have free choice. It can't decide not to do the evil deed. The Talmud says there's a practical difference between these two answers. It's kind of cute. What if a Kohen says to an Israelite, go and betroth a divorced woman for me? If the reason is that the Israelite should have listened to God who told him not to betroth a divorced woman, well, actually, there is no such mitzvah for an Israelite not to marry a divorced woman, only for a Kohen. So according to that line of reasoning, the shaliach would not be liable. Although that's kind of strange. It's kind of artificial because although I am not commanded, I am not a Kohen, by the way, I'm not commanded to avoid marrying a divorced woman. Maybe I should be responsible to avoid arranging a marriage between a Kohen and a divorced woman. However, but according to the opinion that the agent has a choice, well, even if I'm not subject to the liability, I have the choice. Meanwhile, it looks like Ein Shaliach Lidvar Avera means that the Mishaleach, the person who sent him, is indeed going to be free of guilt. Does that make sense? So I'm just taking a look at the Rambam now in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Rotzeach Ushmirat Nefesh, Minayan Shekenu Adin Shenemar Shofech Dam Ha'adam Ba'adam Damo Yishafech. Whoever spills the blood of a person, by a person shall his blood be spilled. Notice the chiastic form. Zeh ha'oreg ba'atzmo shelo al yidei shaliach. That's someone who killed, who's guilty, not through an agent. Et dimchem l'nafshotechem edrosh zeh ha'oreg atzmo, a suicide. Miyad kol chayad rashenu zeh moser chavero lifnei chaya letofro. What if I tie someone up and throw him in front of a lion? I didn't actually do anything. I tied him. Miyad adam miyad ish achiv edrosh et nefesh adam zeh hasocher acherim laharog et chavero. The last clause is if I hired someone to kill someone. I hired a hitman. ובפירוש נאמר בשלושתן לשון דרישה, הרי דינם מסור לשמיים. In all these cases, it says God will require it. So it sounds like the human court will not. So apparently hiring a hitman does not make you chayav. The hitman is chayav. Rav Chanina in Bereshit Rabbah argues that the principle is punishable even in court for Bnei Noach from these same verses. There's Shammai Hazaken argued that the principle is chayav in these cases, case involving Herod. But it looks like the dominant line in Jewish law is that if you hire someone to do something evil, or you ask someone to do something evil, you become the principal, and it's only through the hand of God that you get punished, not through a human court. And Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk in the Meshech Chochmah says, if you have a partnership that owns a hole in the public thoroughfare on Commonwealth Avenue, and one of the partners tells the other one, why don't you dig the hole, or why don't you uncover the hole? Maybe someone will fall in. The person who made the suggestion is not going to be punishable because ein shaliach lidvar avera. And Rav Meir Simcha says, Hainu delav delifnei iver lo titein mishol ika. You can't say he's innocent. He has broken the law of do not put a stumbling block before the blind. The isura dvar Torah Delo ke Mishnah Lamelech. And that is a Torah prohibition, and that's not like the Mishnah Lamelech, the commentary on the Rambam. We'll see what the commentary on the Rambam has to say. And furthermore, there's another pasuk, lo tasim damim beveitecha. You should not put blood in your house by having a dangerous condition. And here, if somebody digs a hole on Commonwealth Avenue, that's a dangerous condition. Machmat, whether he did it bedat or machmat tavato, or he wanted to, or because of his confusion, or because he did it on purpose, in any case, advising someone to do something bad is a lav. So you can't say that he's patur midinei shamayim. The person who advises, the principal who advises someone else to do evil is chayav midinei shamayim, even though the court can't get him. V'im me'itzol lefi darko uchiyotza bo have kemo lav shebechlalot ve'ein lokin alav. We don't give stripes for lifnei iver. And he's got a source in the Rambam. So, is everybody still with me? I hope so. Anyway, not like the Mishnah Lamelech. The Mishnah Lamelech, Rabbi Yehuda Rosanes, who lived in Istanbul from the middle 1600s to the middle 1700s, says that the principle is free even according to the laws of heaven. Because look at that rule. The person who actually did the evil deed should have listened to God instead of listening to the principle. However, if the principal has power over the agent, either as owner or regular employer, or offers payment for the evil deed, maybe he is responsible b'dinei shamayim. That's different from if the principal just said, why don't you kill that person, or why don't you dig that hole? The Mishnah Lamelech explores these levels as perhaps the intent of Ritva, Rav Yom Tov Asvili, that is to say, the man from Seville in Spain, who finds the principal liable for hiring the agent and free only in the case of mere speech. What are the consequences of being guilty by the law of heaven? Professor and Rabbi Aaron Kirschenbaum distinguishes among 3 levels of extrajudicial condemnation, not mutually exclusive. They could all 3 apply. There's formal community ostracism. The leaders of the community could say, we don't daven with this guy, don't do business with him. Or informal community ostracism. And there's also divine judgment. If he's enough of a believer, b'dinei shamayim means he's going to get his when God gets around to punishing him. You can find Professor Kirschenbaum's article in Dinei Yisrael, a journal that he founded on Dinei Yisrael, on that topic. And the article is called Iyunim L'Shlichut L'Dvar Avera. So what about the principal? Maybe the principal should be guilty, but we don't really expect human courts to do it, although I have seen Professor Kirschenbaum did find examples of tshuvot where the rabbi said, yeah, in this case, we are going to punish him. But look at how this works out in the modern world. Robert Massey, the president and owner of Oil Chem here in Michigan, pleaded guilty to violation of the Clean Water Act. The charge stems from the illegal discharge of landfill leachate, some horrible, oily, toxic stuff, more than 47 million gallons, which went into the sewer system in Flint over an 8.5-year period. And he pled guilty. I don't know what the punishment is going to be, but consider that he owned the corporation. He probably didn't personally dump 47 million gallons of toxic, oily muck into the sewers of Flint. He probably had workers doing that. Should the workers who actually did the deed suffer greater punishment than the owner of the company? And another example, a former executive at a mortgage records company pleaded guilty on Tuesday to a scheme to file fraudulent documents used in foreclosures. And the newspaper article that I grabbed this from said this is a rare prosecution of a top-level employee following the robo-signing scandal. Usually the top-level people don't get charged with anything. Usually people who work for much less money get charged and the top-level people get off. But in even more radical case, sometimes the corporation pleads guilty to civil or criminal offenses, and no human being gets charged with any wrongdoing. Notice the parallel to the Talmud's extravagantly artificial claim of agency to do evil on the part of a person's real estate, a fenced yard. Well, a corporation is just as much a legal fiction as a fenced yard's ability to acquire things. So I picked a few examples. It wasn't hard to find them. The McKeeson Corporation agreed to pay more than $13 million to settle claims that it failed to report suspicious sales of prescription medication. Notice the date in 2008. And then it agreed to pay $150 million for failure to report suspicious orders of pharmaceutical drugs in 2017. And I didn't record it, but it's in the news right now. They're working out another deal where the corporation is going to have to pay a lot of civil penalties, but no human being is implicated in that. And an even more shocking example, the opioid manufacturer Purdue Pharma pleads guilty to fraud and kickback conspiracies. Federal court, a felony plea. The corporation is guilty of a felony, but no human being is guilty of anything. Now that might change. The people in this corporation may still be subject to charges, but at this moment we have a situation that's just as artificial as you can't call me guilty of anything. It's my backyard did it. Here we have 3 felony conviction charges, sending a strong message to the pharmaceutical industry that illegal behavior will have serious consequences for the corporation, but not for any human beings. Meanwhile, what are we arguing about? We're arguing about whether rabbis, students of Talmud, consider the bad deed done by someone who hires or entices someone else to do a bad deed is punishable in Jewish law or only punishable b'dinei shamayim, when actually most of the period that we're of rabbinic law, the rabbis don't have the power to punish the people they think should be punished in court either. So it's all, what is this, a word game? This one we would punish if we could, but we can't. And that one we wouldn't even punish if we could, and we can't. Can there exist legal, and what's the value of legal culpability without practical consequences? Famously, Oliver Wendell Holmes, in a book called The Path of the Law, said, if you want to know the law and nothing else, you must look at it as a bad man who cares only for the material consequences which such knowledge enables him to predict, not as a good one who finds his reasons for conduct, whether inside the law or outside of it, in the vaguer sanctions of conscience. A person without any conscience at all might still be restricted by the law. And that's what the law is for, according to Holmes. Well, if that's what law is for, then I don't know what we're doing when we study Talmud. Fortunately, there's another model. Susan Last Stone, a law professor who also knows her way around the Talmud, reviewed a book by Chaim Simon called Halacha, Rabbinic Law as Culture. And she, Professor Stone, looks back at Robert Cover's breathtaking article, Nomos and Narrative. Cover says there are 2 models of law. Law is paideia, fancy Greek word, I think, that means a model, an educative model. It's expressive, personal, centered on communal aspirations. Legal interpretation's not about technique or authority. It's about striving toward perfecting communities in the world. A body of norms the community develops and comes to see as demanding, as a demanding object, urging its adherents and especially its interpreters to realize the values. Further in that same review, she points out that Chaim Simon says, did I say Simon says? No laughing. Chaim Simon asked, what precisely does it mean when sorts of questions we're used to labeling as moral, theological, ethical, political, and the like are all subsumed under one project, halacha, and approached through Talmudic reasoning? In short, as Simon puts it, the law is almost entirely of the culture and does the work that other societies assign to art, literature, writing, history, as well as theology and ethics. So what we're doing when we study Talmud is not really figuring out how to punish bad guys. It's figuring out what our community is trying to achieve. And there, the distinction between ein shaliach lidvar avera, agency to do evil or no agency to do evil, is interesting. One more, if you say that the principle is not protected by ein shaliach lidvar avera, by our sense that the actual person who does the evil deed is the person who did the evil deed and deserves punishment. One problem is that the principle very often does not actually deliver direct orders. So, for instance, Henry II of England said, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest or turbulent priest or troublesome priest? And that wasn't an order, was it? But 4 knights went from Normandy to Canterbury and they killed Thomas Becket. And the phrase is used in modern day context to express that a ruler's wish may be interpreted as a command by his subordinates. Another example, a professor of linguistics studying the speech pattern of mafiosi, who, I suppose if you've ever seen a gangster movie, you know the mafiosi speak in code. The capo di tutti capi does not say, kill that person. He has some veiled hint. Well, it's not just in the movies. According to this linguistics professor, the mafia turncoat Tommaso Bruschetta describes it. They communicate with one another about their crimes in code. No one will give you a blow-by-blow account of a crime. It's enough, one should never ask more, that a person makes it clear, even through his silence, that he was the author of the crime. A gesture, a look, a wink is enough. So mafia boss Michele Greco explains why Gigino Pizzuto was executed. He says a man who signs IOUs and defaults must settle them sooner or later. And the Menad Vicari crime family says, once a sheep vanished and nobody has heard of it since. It's not just the mafia. Alexander Vindman, a man who spent many years in the military, tells you the culture I come from, the military culture, when a senior asks you to do something, even if it's polite and pleasant, it's not to be taken as a request. It's to be taken as an order. So how could a human court determine who was guilty if the person who gave the orders didn't actually phrase them as orders? And now I think it's time for me to come back to where I started, from the talk by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein that so electrified me when I heard it. That now, 50 years later, or close to 50 years later, I still remember it. He said, the demand of no agency to do evil weighs much more heavily on us in the modern world than it did in the ancient world. In antiquity, people generally had an arm's length relationship with people who asked them to do something or issued orders. Even the largest ancient organizations, the military, generally involved loyalty to your local commander rather than to a long chain of command. Even as recently as the time of the American Civil War. The American Civil War was recently. My great-grandparents were born just about when the American Civil War started. And I'm a great-grandfather, so it doesn't seem like so long ago. Rabbi Lichtenstein said the Confederacy retained that ancient practice of identifying units by the name of the commander rather than by some abstract number or title. When someone asked you to take action, you knew who asked you to take action. In the modern world, we often serve complex organizations with long chains of command. The superior asking us to act resides far up the chain is an abstraction to us. These huge bureaucracies operate smoothly because we act, and we're expected to act, as little cogs in the machine with no expectation that we will question their morality. But the Torah demands that we do not see ourselves as little cogs, but as responsible human beings commanded to do good and not evil. Given instructions or an order, we must find out if carrying out that order advances evil. We have to ask. We have not an excuse, I'm just following orders. We have no excuse of the form, I was just doing my job. Asking, exercising our own consciences would necessarily decrease the efficiency of any organizations we work for. It would slow the machinery. It might well get us fired. In the military, it might subject us to punishment. It might indeed. Soldiers have an obligation to carry out the orders of their superiors. They also have an absolute obligation to refuse to carry out patently illegal orders. Professor Kirschenbaum points out that that leaves a gap. What if the order is illegal? What if the order offends the soldier's conscience, but it's not patently illegal? It's arguably illegal. That puts the soldier in the horrible spot of perhaps being subject to punishment for not carrying out orders, or subject to punishment for carrying out the orders, and no recourse to protect himself. In any case, there's no agency to do evil. We must act as responsible human beings, which means it's our job, even as cogs in the machine of a corporation, to make sure that what we're doing is actually is actually good and not evil. So Rav Lichtenstein said, it weighs much more heavily on us than it did on ancient people to even try to carry out, to recognize ein shaliach lidvar avera. This is, by the way, not a modern problem entirely, although Rav Lichtenstein pointed out that it's considerably worse in the modern world. If you remember, the very first human beings, Chava asked, why did you eat the fruit? Said, the snake told me to do it. And Adam said, the woman you gave to me, she told me to eat, and I ate. And apparently the excuse, I was just following orders, was not entirely successful with the first human beings, but it seems like that excuse goes back a long, long way. That's most of what I meant to say. I would love to hear questions, observations, thoughts about this.
I can start. Having watched some of the impeachment proceedings today, where they're trying to pin the riots in the Capitol building on ex-President Trump, I can see where there's relevance to your topic today. I don't know if this was planned purposely, but even in the other cases of, you have Hitler, who basically didn't necessarily on his own go out and kill any Jews. And then in contrast with that, you have David HaMelech with the story of Uriah, where he basically doesn't kill Uriah, but he puts him on the front of the line so that he's more likely to get killed so he can marry Bathsheba. So you have all these situations of people in power who, comparable to some of the cases you cited, are sort of offhandedly telling people to do bad things, and they did. So where's the culpability come in for all of these cases?
Yeah, well, thank you. Actually, Ellen asked me if I would be willing, Ellen Hertzmark asked me if I would be willing to give a class to the young Israel of Brookline a couple of months ago, I think, maybe more. And I said, yeah, and this is the topic. So the fact that it's in today's news, I can't take credit for it, although it was really nice of the legislature of the United States to arrange to make my topic more topical. Yes, David HaMelech sends to Uriah's commander a recommendation that Uriah be put someplace dangerous and left alone where Uriah is likely to get killed. Chagai Hanavi says, you have killed Uriah with the sword of Bnei Ammon, with the sword of the Ammonites. And this verse is quoted, I think it's quoted by Shammai Hazaken himself as proof that there is such a thing as shliach lidvar avera, at least in the situation of a king. How far Shammai Hazaken took that, I don't know. But notice that if the rationale for saying the mishaleach, the principal, is not guilty, is after all the shaliach, the agent who carried out the deeds, should have listened to God and not to the commander, you got to pay attention to the power gradient and say, when it's the head of state who's asking you to do something, it's extremely hard for people to say no. So the people who did the evil deed are certainly guilty, but maybe the state is also somewhat guilty.
Yet we also count that against Yoav, the commander, for doing that. But I have another question, which is, in many cases in court where somebody does certain types of damage to somebody else's property, we say that although the court will not impose a payment, the person, latzeti de shamayim, to fulfill the, to clear his obligation in the heavenly court, as it was, should pay for the damage anyway. What about the case of the mishaleach here, where there's some monetary liability? Somebody hired, a break and entry guy to go steal something from somebody else's house, or something that would cause, or to slash somebody else's tires or whatever. When we say that perhaps he's guilty, the mishaleach is guilty in the eyes of heaven, does that mean he has an religious obligation to pay for the damage? Let's say the shliach is judgment proof.
Yeah, indeed. I mentioned that Professor Kirschenbaum lined up fear of heaven, formal communal pressure, and informal communal pressure. The court also might say, look, we're not going to take the money away from you that you owe this man b'dinei shamayim. If he happens to get his hands on any money that belongs to you, we're not going to make him pay you back, because really you should owe him the money. Or it might say, the court might say, morally speaking, you owe that much money. We're not going to force you to pay it. On the other hand, we're also not going to consider you an upstanding member of the community. We won't treat you as a kosher witness anymore unless we find out that you paid that money. We won't let you be shliach tzibur anymore, because we know that morally you should pay that money. That's quite possible. And we even have cases in Psak. I think the Rit al-Ghazi, an Algerian rabbi, dealt with a case where there was a known moser, somebody who turned over Jewish property or Jewish lives to hostile non-Jewish authorities, and somebody else gave information to this moser and asked him to do stuff, and the rabbi said, "Divrei harav v'divrei hatalmid mi shamid." Who should you listen to? Doesn't apply here, because you know that the shaliach is going to be a moser, is going to use this information. And therefore you are just as culpable as if you had done it personally, and we are going to take care of you as if you were personally a moser. So occasionally courts have been willing to do that.
Nelson has a question.
Why isn't there a notion of divided responsibility in such cases? It's perfectly obvious. You've clearly made the case that the shaliach obviously bears legal responsibility for his conduct, but why shouldn't he share the responsibility with the mishaliach? Intuitively, it just cries out that the mishaliach bears some measure, at least equal, of responsibility.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and there's a lot of rabbinic byplay about just how guilty is the mishaleach.
Clearly guilty enough so that in the next life he'll get what he deserves. He's not off the hook forever, So the question of guilt is taken for granted.
Yeah, although there could also be circumstances where he says, I didn't pay him. I wasn't his commanding officer. I wasn't his employer. I just said to him, you want that piece of jewelry? Why don't you just steal it? And I didn't think he was going to do it. I was, to quote various political leaders in the United States, didn't you know I was joking?
Well, in fact, you quote the political leaders, but there is that, is raised as a possibility in the Gemara also. Right? That the guy could have said, well, I didn't really think he'd go do it.
Yeah, Mishata Aniba. I was playing. Yeah.
Professor, I was learning recently about the plagues that Hashem visited on Mitzrayim, and specifically Hoshech, the Makkah of Hoshech. And it says, like, when we read the Haggadah, that the signs God sent were faithful in their mission, and they did not rebel against his word. Well, it seems like they were like a shliach, and the whole argument was they went above and beyond what God commanded, that they were not, and they were exempt from punishment for going beyond the plague of darkness, what God had intended, and it added to the tumult that it caused the Egyptians. Is there anything you can comment? I mean, that's just the background of what I recollect.
That
where the shliach is not is adding on to the mission of their own accord, right?
Fascinating. I don't feel competent to talk about it at the moment. But what if the shaliach is sent to do something and he does more than the mishaleach asked him to do, or less? If
I
it's
heard an
not
interesting story in shul. I forget. Rabbi Hellman told this story about in the concentration camps when they were counterfeiting the British currency. Does anyone remember that story? And they were like under death. There was a really good counterfeiter, and they didn't know whether to do it or not. And like it worked out. I mean, it's like a weird thing, where you're not. I mean, where you're. I don't know. It's a complicated. But the thing is that the Makos were like shlichim from God. It says that God himself executed the 10th plague, right? So it seemed like they were not held.
We have just moved over into the land of Midrash.
All right.
The land of Midrash, inanimate objects could have volition. But I intended this talk to be just in the land of law.
Fair enough.
I have a question. It relates to something you talked about before about if something is about whether if it's forbidden for the agent or not. So can you appoint an agent to do something that would be forbidden for you to do, but which is permitted for the agent to do? For example, like let's say it's Erev Shabbat and you have accepted Shabbat upon yourself, right? So it's now forbidden for you to violate Shabbat. Can you ask somebody who hasn't accepted Shabbat to do something which is against Shabbat, but they're allowed to do it, even though they're doing it for you?
Sweet question. I actually know the answer to that one.
Okay.
When it comes to Shabbat, if you have accepted Shabbat and he has not, the asking another Jew who has not yet accepted Shabbat to do something, at least as Rabbi Soloveitchik taught it, does not violate Shabbat in any way. It is, if you'd ask a non-Jew to do something for you at that moment, that might be more problematic. But since the Jew has his own beginning of Shabbat and it hasn't begun, at least Rabbi Soloveitchik's analysis was that there was no problem there. However, the broader question still remains, and there's an actual explicit Talmudic discussion of it, which I alluded to very briefly earlier in this hour. What if you are male and there are a series of Torah laws about where you're allowed to shave your beard and hair, and you tell a woman who does not have any of those laws to shave the hair of a child. So you are not allowed to shave the hair, and the woman doesn't have this mitzvah, although she might have the mitzvah of not contributing to someone else's getting shaved, but that's not directly her mitzvah. And that's explicitly discussed in the Talmud in Kiddushin, worth looking at. Also, by the way, it's become fashionable to neuter pets. If you have a dog, I'm pretty sure that a male dog is not to be neutered according to halacha. It's not clear what it seems like non-Jews do not have this mitzvah. What if you give the dog to a non-Jewish veterinarian and say, neuter my dog?
Can you have shlichut with a non-Jew? Anybody?
Well, technically speaking, it's not shlichut, but ein shlichut lidvar avera spills over the technical question of shlichut. Spills over the edges of that, because if you hire a non-Jewish hitman, and the other way around, if your local mafia boss hires you as a hitman, these principles still apply, even if technically it doesn't get the name shlichut. By the way, the questions of dealing in stolen properties and hiring hitmen show up in a brand new book by the book is called Crime in Jewish History and Crime, published by Wayne State University Press. I meant to leave it on my desk so I could read the name of the book and the name of the author to you, but brand new book. And one of the things he discovers is that in the High Middle Ages in Carolingia, Jews and non-Jews had a lot of patience for respectable businessmen who had business relationships with thugs and robbers, but not with murderers.
The author is Ephraim Shoham.
Ah, yes, that's the name. Thank you, Harvey. Oh, so good to see you. And so good to be talking to a librarian who knows the answers to all these questions. Yes, that's the name of the book, and go out and buy a copy of it. It's fascinating reading.
But even non-Jews aren't allowed to kill, so therefore hiring a non-Jewish hitman would go against the hitman's restrictions too. So I mean,
yes.
So it's the same as asking a Jew to do something that a Jew's prohibited from doing.
Seems that way to me, even though as Ari, is it, suggested, in technical Talmudic terms, we don't call it shlichut exactly, but the same considerations apply.
Now, with respect to the laws of shlichut, it seemed to me are a d'oraita principle. I think. Well, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is: are the exceptions to shlichut d'oraita or d'rabanan? Right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the laws of shlichut are d'oraita, because if you marry someone using an agent, the wedding has really happened, and you can't say.
Although you could argue that
my mind.
You could argue that any wedding done that way is only effective d'Rabbanan, right? I think there's a
You could argue, but I don't think
But
so.
it's not correct, I don't think. 'Cause
No,
we'll,
it's not
we'll
correct.
execute somebody who has an affair with the woman involved.
Yes,
But also, at least some of the exceptions are derived from psukim, right?
yes.
Atem b'nei brit, af shluchem b'nei brit. So that would seem to say that at least some of the exceptions are deoraita.
well, unless it's an asmachta ba'alma.
Yeah, but remember the example of you have to slaughter the Pesach. If every one of us has a mitzvah to slaughter the Korban Pesach.
No, yeah, no, I'm not. But so I'm asking about the exceptions, right? So
There's one more exception that I didn't mention, which is a mitzvah that must be done with your body is normally taken to be not available to shlichut, not amenable to shlichut. You can't say, I'm not able to sit in my sukkah. I'd prefer to have you sit in my sukkah for me, and I'll stay inside where it's warm.
Well, and even when
You
it comes
can't
to
say-
marriage,
My late friend, Brian Krasner, in his illness, was unable to put his own tefillin on, and a sweet man, Mr. Kalfas, actually helped him by putting the tefillin on Brian's arms. But he didn't fulfill the mitzvah by putting the tefillin on Mr. Kalfas's arm. He put it on Brian's own arm. And a wedding can be affected by a shaliach. A wedding, ha'isha niknes b'shlosha derachim b'shtar b'kesef uvavia. I think you could imagine the shaliach does shtar and kesef. I don't think that the third method would work al yedei shaliach.
and indeed, we really, when you say you get married by shlichut, you can effect kiddushin by shlichut. Nisuin is not by shlichut because again,
Yeah, not nisuin. And my late teacher, Rabbi Eliezer Cohen, of blessed memory, got a lot of pleasure from asking people if they could figure out why a certain Acharon said that, in fact, you could do tefillin al yedei shaliach. The shaliach could put tefillin on his own arm, and the mitzvah would devolve on you. And he used to enjoy challenging people to try to make sense out of that, because at first glance, it seems impossible. And there's a great weight of rabbinic thought that says it's impossible. Okay.
Robert wants to say something.
Having trouble unmuting myself.
Oh, you have succeeded.
Yes. So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about why I'm sitting here today. And this is I can't prove this, but this is a family story. I'm sitting here today because my grandfather knew a guy at his bank and they were friendly. And one day he called him and he said, Wilhelm, the SS were just here, the Gestapo, I think it was. They're coming to arrest you tonight. You have to get out of Dodge. And fortunately, my grandparents, just by good luck, they were able to leave Germany that night with my father and my aunt. And I don't know if we would have survived if he hadn't done that, but it certainly helped. So I'm very interested in what are the ethics of not doing what you're told to do? What are the ethics of them not following Edward II's hint of not doing what was the law of the land under the Nazis, or perhaps the law of the land under President Trump if you were an officer of the law on the southern border and you were told to drag children out of their mother's arms. What are our responsibilities?
So I have a sentence in mind. I don't remember who said it though. The sentence is, it's now clear that the most important question in ethics is what you will not do. And I think that comes close to Rabbi Lichtenstein's point. I think that the Border Patrol people got orders to take the babies away from their parents, and they should have said, we're not doing it. But, and I think that the bank officer who said to your father's father, they're coming for you, get out of town, has done your grandfather a great favor and has done me a great favor, because I would never have known you if you were never born.
Maybe,
Can I ask
maybe,
one last? Oh, sorry, Dr. Hubin.
Dr.
okay.
Hubin,
maybe we should also remember that there are good things that happen by sometimes not listening to the orders. So when Moses is asked to put his arm upon Joshua to make sure that he will have the honor and the public appointment of his successor, he takes both hands and puts them on. And we consider that to be a great gesture of proper, but going beyond the law, going beyond what he needed to do. So there are many decisions that are to be made by the person who has been given a particular job, a particular
I think we maybe have lost Jeffrey Hubin, but I get the point. Sometimes sent to do something, you use your independent quality to do something better than what you've been asked to do.
Rivkin Eliezer is one. I mean, maybe Rivkin Eliezer. Can I ask you, there was a case in Massachusetts a few years ago involving a young woman who egged her boyfriend, I guess it was, on the telephone to kill himself, you know? And she was judged guilty of manslaughter. And the whole case was, she didn't pull the trigger, you know, and she told him things, but it was his decision. So here in Massachusetts, she was found guilty and it went to the Supreme Court and she served like 4 or 5 years and just got out. So.
Yeah, so if you say ein shliach lidvar avera is a gzerat hakatuv, is an arbitrary rule that it doesn't have to make sense, it's what the biblical verse demands, then I guess you'd have to say you can't find her guilty of manslaughter. And if you say ein shliach is derived by logic from the principle that he should have known enough not to kill himself, then indeed you could raise the question, in this particular circumstance, it appears that he didn't know enough and she was exploiting his weakness, and then maybe she should indeed serve time for that.
But that was the case where you're giving fire to like a deaf mute or someone. And I remember that case was only, the Mishaleach is only guilty in Shemayim, though. Isn't that true?
B'dinei Shemayim.
So,
yeah.
I mean, he
Okay,
wasn't
everybody.
obviously in a good state of mind. So,
All right.
thank you.
But let us thank Rabbi Finkelman and let him go get off the line, because he's certainly done his duty to us. So thank you very much.
oh, God.
Thank
have a
you.
question?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll get some other way.
It's been an
everybody.
enormous pleasure. Thank you all.
Nice to see everybody.